Thank you, Dale, and thanks to all of you for coming out today. We're excited and honored to be here. Again, my name is Roger Zakheim. I'm director of the Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., which is the think tank arm, the thought leadership arm. Hold on, the music's coming right in. Of the Reagan Library, which is based in California, in Simi Valley. So we have a packed program, as Dale mentioned. We have our experts from the Reagan Institute. We have Dr. Janet Tran, who is our lead director of our Center for Civics Education and Opportunity. She'll be coming up first to lead the conversation on civics. All of you should have had on your table something that will guide your lunch conversation. And the first piece of that is civics, which Janet is an expert in. And then we'll have a session after, towards the end of lunch, from my colleague Rachel Hoff, who leads our Center for Freedom and Democracy, talking about the state of freedom in the world. But before we do that, if you'd indulge me and us, rather than stand here and describe what the Reagan Institute is, what we do, I figure I'll defer to the 40th President of the United States to share with you a little bit more about the Reagan Institute.
It seems I've been guided by a force much larger than myself, a force made up of ideas and beliefs about what this country is and what it could be.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, where the timeless principles and American values that Ronald Reagan championed are celebrated and promoted. Individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. Also here, everyone is charged with completing the President's unfinished work, and in doing so, making America and the world a better place, not only for our children, but for many generations to come.
Because we're a great nation, our challenges seem complex. It will always be this way. But as long as we remember our first principles and believe in ourselves, the future will always be ours.
And therein lies the challenge. In the complexities of today's world, the task will be difficult. We take heart in knowing that the vision, ideals, and leadership of President Reagan will inspire us and the work that still needs to be done. The mission begins with the Reagan Library and the Reagan Foundation in Simi Valley, California, a place that was created to not only share President Reagan's story and the lessons he taught us, but as a springboard for launching new initiatives that will keep those lessons burning bright.
Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
These initiatives are strengthened today at the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., where the nation's decision makers sit and where critical policies are made. It represents the fulfillment of the Board of Trustees and First Lady Nancy Reagan's wish that President Reagan's legacy would forever be a dynamic force and presence in the capital of the free world.
If he were able to be here tonight, he would once again remind us of the power of each individual, urging us once again to fly as high as our wings will take us and to never, never give up on America.
Today at the Institute, they're doing just that by building on President Reagan's vision and leadership example through issue-driven forums, academics, and scholarly work at 3 policy centers: the Center for Civics, Education, and Opportunity, the Center for Freedom and Democracy, and the Center for Peace Through Strength. The Institute is also invested in helping the next generation become tomorrow's leaders, and is doing this through the Leadership and the American Presidency program. The ultimate goal is to empower young leaders and ordinary citizens to live out the American ideals and principles that President Reagan stood for.
My fondest hope is that Americans will travel the road, extending forward from the arch of experience, never forgetting our heroic origins, never failing to seek divine guidance as we march boldly, bravely into a future limited only by our capacity to dream.
As former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan remarked, if there was ever a moment when we needed the clarity of President Reagan's vision and example, it is now. We need to renew and relearn the principles that he advanced and apply them to the problems of the day. You're invited to join in carrying out the mission of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, to be inspired by the 40th President's ideas, values, and actions, and to help promote his legacy of changing the world for the better through strong leadership and a spirit of determination.
We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something, for liberty and freedom and fairness. And these are things worth fighting for, worth devoting our lives to. And we have good reason to be hopeful and optimistic.
Lofty goals, ambitious program, ideas, principles, values. How do you make them relevant today? How do we take these principles and make them relevant in the 21st century, not just for our generation, but for the next generation? President Reagan was known for restoring American pride. He came into office when it was at a low. He left office when it was at a high. How do we do that again? The key there is civics. The key there is what President Reagan referred to as an informed patriotism. And I'm honored to introduce my colleague, Dr. Janet Tran, who's an expert in how we do just that for not just Americans today, but for America's tomorrow. Janet, over to you.
Thanks so much, Robert. Do I need a microphone? Are we good, or do you want the microphone for recording purposes? All right. Sounds good. I promise I won't break into karaoke. That's how I feel with a microphone. So I'm Janet, and I'm here to talk about my life's work, which is the civic mission of schools, something that's very dear to my heart. Prior to joining the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, I had the privilege to serve as a teacher leader in South Central Los Angeles and downtown LA, where civics, when access to civic life, is really if you want to think about it through the lens of social justice, or if you want to think about it through the lens of individual liberty, it is the key and crucial issue of our time, and I believe should be restored in our civic mission of schools. So I'm going to share with you some really dark stuff, but I promise it's not all doom and gloom, and I do think the kids are going to be okay. So first, I want to provide a little bit of context as to what is happening in America, and we do have to start that with a little bit of a national scope. And I'm not going to steal all of Rachel's thunder, because she'll go into that before we start. Is where we are in terms of the health of our democracy. And as you can see from this Freedom House statistic, the last 10-year trajectory is probably not the direction we want to go as a country that, we could say we were entrepreneurs in democracy, if you will. An 11-point decline means that we are actually below Argentina and Mongolia at this point. And some of the factors that lead to this are a perception of unequal treatment and a lot of essentially distrust in our institutions as a whole. This is what we'd call a wicked problem, meaning that there's no easy solution, and oftentimes to make small wins towards the ultimate solution, we have to take many steps backward. I'm not going to go into this too much because this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, but state of the nation ultimately, right, is there are some cracks and flaws in our democracy. One reason is because Americans don't actually know too much about how our government functions. And this is just one example, but a lot of statistics are pooled. Things like more Americans can name the Three Stooges than anyone on the Supreme Court. And most can name American Idol judges, but not a single member of the Supreme Court. I chose to focus on just one out of this annual Annenberg Civics survey that you can see across the board. This one is percentage of people who can actually name the 3 branches of government. So a little over half, and actually hard fought and recently won because of a lot of our turmoil in the last 2 years. There has been an increase of people who can identify them. Now, civic knowledge is a little dicey. Just because you can name the branches doesn't make you an exemplary citizen. I'd consider that a little bit of the floor, not the ceiling, right? Fun facts is obviously 20% of Americans polled, they can't name a single branch. So 20% can't name any, and 1%, my favorite statistic, is they just flat out refuse. They said, we don't actually even want to talk about this. And I'd love to know more about that 1%. It's a bit depressing, but I would argue that most Americans don't need to name a Supreme Court member to be knowledgeable. They need to understand what's on the docket, why it affects them. The why is probably more significant. So that's a little bit of the positive side. The other piece, if you're looking at civics in terms of knowledge, skills, dispositions, and identity, is the participation piece. And there's been a lot of research in recent years on the lack of civic participation. Terms like civic deserts, meaning there's less opportunity to essentially engage. You can think of those as more rural areas, the urban centers that you know have lack of access in terms of civic associations. The concept of bowling alone is extremely important here. This was coined in '95 by Bob Putnam, who really started looking at what Alexis de Tocqueville back in the day said about America. We had associations, much like this one, where people came together and ultimately built bonding and bridging sort of capital so that we had people to rely on and civic life to depend upon. We weren't islands by ourselves. But what Putnam found in '95 was more people were bowling, but less people were in leagues. So this image of a lone bowler going out with no community, no friend network, no neighborhood to depend on has really struck a chord, and he's followed up his work in prevalent years. The other concept is the big sort, which is Americans essentially deciding what, when, who they spend their time with. And it's generally going to be people who think like them. And this has been geographical, but as well as our online life as well, that we can sort ourselves, just remove people we don't want to hear, unfriend people on Facebook, block people on their cell phones. Everyone is essentially becoming this orbit that is very homogenous, and this is problematic to our civic life and discourse for obvious reasons. And then finally, a civic engagement gap, which is an opportunity for an invitation to participate. And that is aligned to the civic deserts as well, but that starts early in the schools. So if there's not an opportunity to, volunteer at a Key Club or be part of Future Farmers for America or any of these old civic institutions, there's less connection and less bridging capital. So the next piece of the puzzle is trust. You can see this fund public trust in government near historic lows. And as usual, you're going to see a bump with any sort of the Gulf War. You're going to see during the Reagan years a nice steady rise. And then you're also going to see a little bit of restoration during the prosperity, during the Clinton era, and then a bump to 9/11. And now we're more or less in a holding pattern of pretty low trust. I'd say this one might be the bump from the election that it held, but ultimately Americans don't trust our institutions and our government. And we don't trust one another anymore. So this is a chart on political polarization and how we feel about one another. We're just looking at Democrats and Republicans, but ultimately what we're seeing is from 2016 to 2019, the other party is increasingly less satisfied and think, Democrats feel like Republicans are more closed-minded up. Republicans feel like Democrats are more closed-minded. The biggest jump is from the immoral piece, and I want to focus on that because that's the danger zone. If we think one another are actually immoral people, then it becomes this epic battle between good and evil. And that is not a way to restore the civic fabric in America. And then the fun fact at the end is just that 36 to 38% of Americans right now just full-scale believe that the other party is not smart, not intelligent. So pretty hard to have a conversation if you're looking across at someone and they've identified as a Democrat and you're like instantly not smart, right? That is no way to create a democracy together and restore and rebuild. This piece is not new, but it has been amplified in recent years, the concept of disinformation and misinformation. So most people do believe there's a great deal. Unfortunately, they think that other people are getting fake news. So how do we discern, how do we prepare Americans to ensure that they can understand what they're seeing in media? And the most alarming is the made-up news, but also alarming is going to be the video images that are altered. And if you've ever seen any in comparisons, these deepfakes are extremely alarming, not just to our civic life, but to our national security as well. A fun fact that I've been tracking for over the decades, and I wanted to do something that was not as recent, is the fact that 17% of Americans believe that the Bush administration was actually behind 9/11. Nefarious, like we knew it was gonna happen, we couldn't wait, this is gonna be awesome, we get to invade Iraq, right? So 17% of Americans polled believe that. And then 15% believe just full well that President Barack Obama was born in Kenya or some other country. And both of these, with the 9/11 report, with the showing of the actual long-form birth certificate and the short form, have been proven incorrect. Yet this is a 2020 poll, so this is over 30% of Americans. I imagine there's some overlap, but the disinformation campaign is real, and there's perverse incentives to do so, there's government misinformation, and then there's obviously some foreign intervention as well. So then, the next question is whether young people believe, or whether we believe, it is important to live in a democracy. And people can't have an abstract allegiance to democracy. There has to be an actual, connection to it. So this is a 2016 report that was pretty seminal from Foe and Monk, and globally, across the world right now, young people are finding it not as important to live in a democracy. So this means that there's an attraction to strongman. Some suggest military, would be great, trusted to come in. Others suggest, socialism as an alternative as well. But when polling people born after 1980, only 30% say it is essential to live in a democracy. This isn't just an age thing, meaning that if we polled people in that same age bracket 30 years ago, that this is alarmingly low. And people in the World War II generation, I want to say, are about 72%. So this generation, if you're looking at your kids, your grandkids, they're just like, it's not too important. I can go somewhere where the weather's good, or those things are much more important to them. So what we are looking at then ultimately is this really toxic stew, this petri dish, if you will, and a sense of foreboding, and a sense that democracy isn't working, especially for young people, a sense that we're failing at this, and almost half of Americans just feel like it's not working well at all. So what we're looking at is data and a lack of confidence, or what President Reagan would call an erosion of the American spirit. And this is from his farewell address, which we really look at as required reading. And it's not just us. Historian John Meacham has put it on his podcast as one of the seminal texts in American history. So the concern for an erosion of American spirit begins with actually understanding what we are teaching this next generation. And how prophetic he is, and I'll go back to this speech over and over because it is our North Star when we do our work here. The erosion of the American spirit means that only 20 people under the age of 30 are extremely proud to be American. And that has gone down significantly from previous generations in that same age. Of course, youngsters will always want to, be influenced or, have ideals, and there's, a lot of disengagement. But this cohort is definitely looking at something different. So, why? Well, in some ways, I'm shocked that it's not worse than it is, because we do not invest in civic education at all. You can see here, we spend $50 per student on a federal basis for STEM topics, but we spend precisely a nickel on students in social studies. And social studies is actually, civics is within that, but I would say that nickel's actually divided up a little more, and that's what you get on civic education. Some people have asked, do we teach civics in the schools anymore? And my answer is yes and no. What we ultimately teach is a class called government in about 46 states, and that takes place at, so I'd say, the end of your senior year, when kids are thinking about prom, college, anything, moving out. So they're not too concerned about what's happening there. Some states, like Florida, actually have an 8th grade civic requirement, but this state is an anomaly. So Illinois and Florida have an 8th grade requirement. 9 states have none at all. And then this statistic is actually a little bit worse than we think about, because many students don't actually get to the 12th grade. So one of the schools I taught at, only 1 out of 4 students graduate. So they are not leaving prepared for civic life at all. So what we're seeing on paper, it's actually probably worse than it is. And arguably, everyone needs to access civic life. So here we are with this divestment in a general divestment in social studies and civics in general. So ever since No Child Left Behind, we have a lack of what you'd call active demand. So everyone I've spoken to said, civics, we need more than that. But parents get on the phone and call for more STEM in the school, Legos, robotics programs. They actually don't have an active demand for civics. In recent years, I think we're seeing a groundswell and a change. What's interesting is, even though there isn't an active demand, a recent pollster, Frank Luntz, worked with Democrats and Republicans to ask, what would have the most positive and meaningful impact on strengthening American democracy? And civic education just knocks the other ones out of the water. Though there is actually a fair amount of support for national service and less money in politics as well, in terms of consensus across parties. But at 57% of all people polled felt this was important, and yet we seem to be unable to agree as to what that means. So I'll share what it means to us. We have established a Center for Civics Education Opportunity at the Reagan Institute. And this work is national in scope at the nexus of education and civic engagement policies. And these 3 pillars, civics education opportunity, really are the sort of the fulcrum of how we think about President Reagan's call for an informed patriotism. When I speak about our North Star, I speak about informed patriotism a bit, and I'll share this, his quote, it'll be better from him. But ultimately, an informed patriotism is these prophetic words that President Reagan warned that national pride that emerged in the 80s wouldn't carry us through. Instead, we have to have that underlying informed piece. So at the Reagan Foundation Institute, we have programs that range from all 50 states, over 70,000 students served, and $1 million in scholarships annually that we reward to students who have civic potential, who are our great communicator debate students, who go through our student leadership programs, who do our simulation centers on site, teachers who get curriculum and programming and support to essentially work through our programs on the K through 12 level. In Washington, D.C., and I'm really worried this is going to pause because I want to humble brag about this program for hours on end, is our Leadership in the American Presidency program. And these are incredible students from all walks of life coming to learn real history from real leaders and do real world work. And they come from us from east, west, left, and right to learn leadership through the lens of the American presidency. But we also trick them because they're learning from each other as well. We work very closely with our partners who are left of center to make sure we have a diverse cohort of students. And we mean diverse in every sense of the word. So not just from geography, ethnic diversity, but political thought as well. What we've been doing with these litmus tests has not worked in Washington, D.C. So ultimately, our students come together with their incredibly different vantage points, go through transformational experiences of interning in Washington, D.C., a innovative leadership program, and we urge them not to change their minds about their views, but if they change their minds about one another, then we'll have done this work right. So, we have many incredible stories and examples of bridging work that happens there. students who voted for President Trump becoming best friends with a Californian Democrat or an undocumented American. So there's really a bridging across all sorts of differences. This last summer, we hosted our first formerly incarcerated student. So really understanding one another and moving away from that big sort is part of our goal, and the boldness of our board and our leadership to invest in a program of students who just they're not just Reagan fans, they're from all over the map. And their ability to work with each other, that is an investment in that next generation of citizen leaders, so they do a better job than we've done. Let's see if this plays. I'll move on. So the other piece we work on is it's with adults. It's with the people who should be doing and making our laws. And the conditions for policy are tough these days, very nuclear. Education, sort of the last bastion of bipartisanship, in the last decade or so has really declined in terms of people being able to find consensus, really politicizing issues that were more or less, there was a coalition that existed before and still can. And we believe we're the right people to do it because the Reagan Institute, President Reagan's brand, if you will, iconic on the right, and I always joke, much more palatable on the left these days. So if we are able to bring folks together under this banner, we will be able to find out where we overlap on the Venn diagram, find out where we say this is the best for all of our students, and it doesn't matter if you get a political win or not. So our space is what I call neutral when it comes to sharing exemplars and sharing where we can talk about the ideas and not our political parties or what bill is going to hit the floor exactly. In recent years, so for our first Reagan Institute Summit on Education, we had an unprecedented 7 secretaries of education across the board. And you see Dr. Jill Biden, who doesn't answer our calls anymore. She seems really busy. We see her introducing 4 secretaries of education. We had cabinet secretaries, and last rise, we had 10 governors in attendance, Democrat and Republican, and we talk about ideas. We do not talk about agendas, but we talk about what is best for our kids and identify areas where we overlap, because we do. Instead of focusing on areas where, ultimately we will, depart from one another, there are areas at work in which we can and should move forward if we agree. So obviously during the pandemic, we moved some of this to our online space, and just, a lot of quotes in terms of individuals vouching for coming together, unity, listening to people we disagree with, and bipartisanship. So Secretary Duncan, who served with President Obama, Secretary Spellings, who served with President Bush, the Walton Family Foundation and the Gates Foundation, definitely different ends of the spectrum, really just trying to find people who are sharing their best ideas. Secretary Duncan said, no one has a monopoly on good ideas, no one party or no one individual. And we think of him as a thought partner because that's absolutely true when we are trying to solve on behalf of our students. We also have our RISE collaboratives. These are more granular, in-depth programs that look at topics such as the workforce of the future, early learning, really trying to convene across difference. And our next one is actually this next week in Mississippi, and we're really excited to look at STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics combined. And always with a bent on how we are better citizens and how we engage there. This program has been really fun because we've been going from state to state virtually and exploring what people are doing, and this is federalism at its best. So education obviously is very local and state-based, as it should be. And the good news is, even though you saw that nickel on the screen, the states are making do and doing incredible things with limited resources. So if we have more national attention, more exemplars and awards given and pats on the back, imagine how far we could go. So we've come across 5 states, and incredible things are happening. So down below there, in Wyoming, they have every single student as a graduation requirement has to go visit all 3 branches of government. So you can bet and better believe that students in Wyoming can get that one question right, and they can name all 3 branches because they can't graduate without a visitation. Now, we can't scale that. You know, in California, it's going to be too big. Not everyone's going to get to their state house. But we can scale a law center, such as in Tennessee, they have local law centers in which students can learn about their rights and, more importantly, their responsibilities. In South Carolina, there's a re-engagement and investment in Palmetto Boys and Girls Clubs. Clubs that perhaps, you know, we can call civics a myriad of things, such as under the umbrella of social emotional learning or under American history. It is happening, and what we've learned has been very encouraging. So a few things. One, place-based efforts. They work, they matter, they're inspiring, and they're non-political. They are of service, they are of high content and quality, and people are doing great things. Pockets of excellence, if you will. The students, so these panelists have been, they're the state superintendent, an exemplary teacher, an awesome student, and a national expert. The students want a voice and make it very clear. These experiences are not extracurricular. These are imperative for them to learn how to be college ready, career ready, and citizen ready. So it shouldn't just be the 2 C's, it needs to be 3 C's. And then the best news for me and for those of us who are involved in the more national discourse on the nightly news is the classroom remains a place of, you know, good dialogue and debate. And it isn't as politicized as we would believe. We actually had folks from Georgia, you'd think one of the more highly contested areas, speak about classrooms that are ultimately, you know, following standards. And what we're hearing from, you know, sort of the outrage content out there and conflict entrepreneurs, as we call them, is happening in a much smaller percentage of the population than we'd like to believe. So it is not all book banning or critical race theory. Most schools are functioning following state standards, and those are the things that are being taught. And parents still have an overwhelming trust in their teachers. So we need to tell more of those stories. Other programs fall into our opportunity conversation. So we hosted an event celebrating the life of the first woman on the Supreme Court, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, at 91 years old and hopefully healthy and well. You can see Justice Sotomayor and Justice Ginsburg and our Attorney General Ted Olson having a wonderful conversation and really thinking about opportunities for women. And we're following up with a women-led civic events later this month. We also have in fall an American Opportunity Boot Camp for students who want to understand economic policies and workforce policies. Fun fact, financial literacy and any sort of economic policy is also something that does not happen. Like civics, it is kind of put to the 12th grade, and financial literacy actually is completely out of the picture. But we're really excited to bring together this next generation of policymakers. And I think I'll end here because the next one's a video, and I don't think that's going to work here. But something that we are intrinsically linked with, someone, is Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman on the Supreme Court, appointed by President Reagan, and they had a very strong relationship, which means that intrinsically we are linked with the organization that Justice O'Connor founded, iCivics, that provides digital learning for students across the country. And I end here because this is work that requires partnerships, and we are in partnership with many coalitions and organizations, whether that's formal holding hands or whether it's informal. This is work that we can't do alone. Civics is not a one-person problem. It's not a one-organization problem. So there are many coalitions that are on the rise right now, Educating for American Democracy, Our Common Purpose, the Partnership for American Democracy, and we have our fingers and toes dipped in every spot because we believe in lifting all boats. Now, does that mean we agree with the coalitions entirely? No, that's American. Dissent is American. But President Ronald Reagan said, if I agree with someone 70% of the time, they're 70% my friend, not 30% my enemy. So I want to end with the practice of democracy is not passed down the gene pool, and we have to recommit to it time and time again. And I hope that you have a little bit of a sense of urgency, and thank you for listening. How are we doing this?
So I think, I know we have lunch being served in a minute, but Janet, why don't you stay up here for a few minutes, and we'll take some questions from the audience, if that's okay. I saw, as Janet was going through her presentation, a lot of people were making use of those pens and pads that were left on the table. So, Janet, why don't you remain up here as you grab a glass of water and chat with, respond to some of the questions. I don't know if there's another microphone in the back there or one right here. We'll take this off. Let's see. We'll give that, and I'll give this over to you perhaps. And this one is, that one does not.
All right, I think it's working.
There we go. Okay. I think we have a question over here in the back.
Yes, it was an excellent talk, and thank you so much. I think the future is in youth, and your leadership program with the youth was a very important one. Now, how do you choose those students?
That is a great question, and I wish we had the resources to have thousands of students to go through this program, because we do not recruit the 4.999 students, Ivy League only. The students, they'll come to us, right? They want a leadership program attached to a presidential brand. So we work with organizations across the board, like Campus Compact or the American Democracy Schools, really focus on their potential to serve, and recommendations obviously matter a lot. But, we look back to our example. President Reagan went to a very tiny college, Eureka College in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. And he was on what they called back then a needy scholarship. And he almost left school, multiple times. It was a Depression era. They didn't have money. And it was his school, his community, his coach actually said, "We need you on the football team." Well, newsflash, he was a terrible football player, right? But it was a community, a civic community that said, this young man might contribute something to the world. So ultimately, they said, we would like him here, and obviously he changed the world. So being really open-minded and trying to find that first student who left their hometown of Indiana, of 700, or trying to find that student who's worked in Oakland restaurants to put himself through college, really making sure those opportunities are available to all, and really thinking about a diverse set of cohorts. We do try to get it in terms of an ideological mix, because we think that's extremely important. Every program in Washington, D.C., besides ours, has more or less of a preference, if not a litmus test. And we are the only one that's actually trying to get people across difference so that we can have substantive dialogue about meaningful issues. They do have to have a semester of college under their belt, and recommendations matter, but it's not as much about your GPA or your glowing, 400,000 clubs that you've been involved in. If you want to change the world, I wish I could have shown you the video. You're welcome to apply, and hopefully you know some great college students to send our way. We have a lot of scholarships thanks to Bob Cochran over there, wherever he is.
Thank you. We're very well organized. Appreciate that. A couple of things. If you could elaborate on the fall 2022 boot camp and how people are chosen for that and what the goal is. Secondly, what is women-led civics and what's the goal of that? These are things you alluded to but didn't nail. And thirdly, what's the coordination with iCivics and what's their goal?
Excellent. So I'll start with the opportunity pieces. This part of our center has been the third pillar, and really thinking about the intersections from education and civics and opportunity. All three of these work in concert with one another. And when we look at opportunity, the lens of being a trailblazer and a bridge builder like Justice O'Connor is a real light or flame for us to follow for women who, never saw themselves in these positions. The rise in women applying to law school after Justice Ginsburg was appointed was a bump, and similar for Justice O'Connor. So this is part of the opportunity premise, that we can't envision ourselves doing something great, and we don't have those examples, similar to students who come from the middle of the country in Indiana, or the President Reagans of the world. We want to share with them that American opportunity is still alive and well. So that event celebrating Justice O'Connor was sort of the opening of our center. And the women-led civics is women who are invested in civic life, whether they are civic junkies like me, or whether they're actually just, taking care of their community. And I really love that question, because I think oftentimes we use language in the academy or in the nonprofit world that normal, good-working, hard-working Americans just don't use. They don't say, the civic health of my community as well. They say, I take care of my neighbors. I take care of my own. I make sure the schools are working, the park is clean. I shovel the snow for my neighbor. So we really have to have more, really wide umbrella in terms of the way we think about serving in civic life. The American Opportunity Boot Camp is in the fall, and we're really excited to bring together students who probably come through a network of our programs. As you saw, we have over 70,000 students going through our programs right now. So we're going to recruit from students who've already been in our programs, but we're also going to look for students who, might not think of themselves as someone who can work in economic policies, might not have the lexicon. There's so much in terms of working in Washington, D.C., where you have to know something already to get there. So we actually look at this boot camp as, you want to work here and you don't need to know anything yet, but you will after 4 days. And we're going to bring together experts on economic policy. We're going to bring debate, opposition, really theoretical as well as the practical work. So praxis is really important to us. Correct. So college, emerging professionals, and graduate students. So that's that program. So it's going to be a 4-day piece in the fall where people who are interested in learning the basics, sort of the 101, if you will. So college, graduate school, and recent college graduates. The purpose is so that they are ready to be an entry-level position, either working in committee or think tank around economic policy. And then the last question was about our partnerships. Was that right?
Yes, yes.
Oh, so in terms of our partnerships, there are a set of coalitions that have been doing work. I alluded to Educating for American Democracy, and that's led out of Justice O'Connor's organization. iCivics is, it's more digital. It's focused on middle school students. Most of our programming is high school and above. But this is a great example of how you can utilize tools that are in the classroom, and it's through games, which is really funny because Justice O'Connor was not a game person at all, and she found it all very amusing. But probably 1 million plus teachers have logged in online, utilizing this as supplemental or core material in teaching civics. And there's a bunch of games, whether it's how you get to the White House, how to run your own campaign. So fun pieces really engaging young people in processes. And their work is also, the coalition is a group of just really disparate organizations, individuals who believe that there should be more civic learning opportunities for our kids. What that looks like, again, very different in approach, but ultimately there is this common belief that high quality civic learning opportunities should be available to all. And if available to all, then we're going to have a more healthy, educated, and informed citizenry. That partnership, I put Justice O'Connor up there because, again, historically, we are intrinsically linked. And she has come to our programs, and we've obviously honored her. So that partnership is just a historical bonds of trust and affection, if you will. But there are plenty of other organizations, whether it's the Chief State Council on School Officers, which we work with in the education arena, civic organizations, League of Women Voters, whatever the case is, where we work with, even if we're not in partnership with, because what lifts all boats is good for civics and America in general.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions right here in the front. I'll take that one. We have information in the front. As you walked in, there's a table, and there's information about the programs. Janet's outlined, as well as what my colleague Rachel will outline after lunch. There we go. Another question over here.
So we don't have programs online, but we do have the capacity to do our programming at the museum, actually in Spanish and in Braille. So really thinking about more inclusive pieces, but that is a good idea in terms of doing more programming that is bilingual, always reaching more audiences. Mm-hmm.
Janet, one question to just push back on your presentation, something that was implicit, but I'd like you to hit on it directly. Talk about civics education, but at the same time you talk about the statistic that 30% of Americans feel that democracy is essential, meaning that the balance do not. Explain to us why civics education would result, in your mind, in more Americans feeling confident about, feeling that democracy is essential to our lives and to our country. Connect those dots for us.
That's a great question. I think what ultimately happens is there's a cycle of distrust. When we think something doesn't work, we disengage. And that's what we've been seeing over the course of the last 2 decades. The Senate in America is designed on purpose to be slow. And yet we have a citizenry right now that doesn't understand the design. So when we see it operating in a slow, deliberative manner, and yes, there are a lot of flaws, and yes, there are things that are extremely disappointing. However, the majority of Americans just think, this isn't working, and I'd like this bill passed tomorrow. And this senator came in and promised they would pass this bill, and now I'm gonna vote them out. So if we don't understand how our structures of government work, we get disappointed, and then we disengage. So it's this cycle, this wicked problem that continues itself. An educated citizenry is the last guardians of democracy. So we have journalism, which has been under duress as well, but the educated citizenry is the last bastion. So if we have young people growing up with an understanding of how to operate within the system, they're going to resolve all of our problems are actually through civic access. If they need better roads, if they need better schools, if they need, how to spend their tax dollars, whether it's innovation or whether it's our repairing and small fixes to the system, understanding how it works will build a level of confidence.
Everybody, please join me in thanking Dr. Janet Tran for that presentation. Just to walk you through now, I believe the buffet lunch is behind me, and there's a card that was on each of your chairs when you walked in, which is kind of a conversation piece for your lunch discussion. Okay, going to go right there, Dale. And so you could review part of what Janet just hit on the civic side and get ready for the next presentation, which will happen towards the end of lunch, led by my colleague Rachel Hoff, who directs the Center for Freedom and Democracy. Here we'll leave the state of civics in the United States and assess the state of freedom and democracy around the world. Great stuff. Thanks for your participation. Lunch is behind me over here. We got the music going also behind me. I'm feeling inspired. I know, turn that off. But the other piece about President Reagan, which was critical in his day and critical today, is freedom. You could not challenge anybody to read anything President Reagan wrote, or watch anything he did in the presidency, and you couldn't go more than 2 or 3 sentences without running into that word freedom. I'd say President Reagan felt that if there was freedom in America, and if there was freedom in the world, we would have prosperity and we would have peace. In other words, there is no prosperity and there isn't true peace unless we enjoy freedom. And our next speaker, Ms. Rachel Hoff, is director of our Center for Freedom and Democracy at the Reagan Institute. I didn't go into bios with respect to Janet. I'll just say something about Rachel right here. She is a veteran of Capitol Hill and think tanks in Washington, is really a fantastic, not just expert in the world of freedom and democracy, but somebody who's an activist as well, who's engaged in these issues, not just understanding them. So Rachel's going to take you through freedom and democracy in today's world. Again, these presentations are not here to depress you, although some of what she will say will certainly do that. But both Janet, you enjoyed that and saw that, but also Rachel too, will share with you how we think and what we're doing to advance freedom and democracy. So please welcome my colleague Rachel Hoff for the second part of the session. We'll have questions at the end.
How about now? There we go. As Roger said, Janet and I are here to talk to you about important topics on which, there may be some doom and gloom, but I promise to get us started on a high note, as Roger did this morning with the words of our 40th president. I want to remind you the way that he spoke about freedom and democracy. They were so core to his presidency, to his rhetoric, to his principles and his values, and they're very important to his legacy as well. The remarks, the speech that this video pulls from was his 1982 address to the British Parliament at the Palace of Westminster. And this was one of the most important speeches of his presidency, and certainly one of the most impactful speeches of his presidency, in terms of the way that it sort of changed the course of the way the US government thought and acted on these issues. But I want you to put yourself back to 1982 as we watch this video. In retrospect, 1982 sounds very close to 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. But 1982, as you'll remember, was very much in the middle, in the height of the Cold War. The tide had not yet turned against communism and for freedom and democracy. And so President Reagan talks about the Cold War, talks about the struggle for freedom in very stark terms in the context, again, of a very active competition between those values.
We have not inherited an easy world. There are threats now to our freedom, indeed to our very existence, that other generations could never even have imagined. At the same time, there is a threat posed to human freedom by the enormous power of the modern state. History teaches the dangers of government that overreaches. Political control taking precedence over free economic growth, secret police, mindless bureaucracy, all combining to stifle individual excellence and personal freedom. We're approaching the end of a bloody century plagued by a terrible political invention, totalitarianism. Optimism comes less easily today, not because democracy is less vigorous, but because democracy's enemies have refined their instruments of repression. Yet optimism is in order, because day by day, democracy is proving itself to be a not at all fragile flower. No, democracy is not a fragile flower. Still, it needs cultivating. If the rest of this century is to witness the gradual growth of freedom and democratic ideals, we must take actions to assist the campaign for democracy. Our military strength is a prerequisite to peace, but let it be clear, we maintain this strength in the hope it will never be used. For the ultimate determinant in the struggle is now going on in the world will not be bombs and rockets, but a test of wills and ideas, a trial of spiritual resolve. The values we hold, the beliefs we cherish, the ideals to which we are dedicated. While we must be cautious about forcing the pace of change, we must not hesitate to declare our ultimate objectives and to take concrete actions to move toward them. We must be staunch in our conviction that freedom is not the sole prerogative of a lucky few, but the inalienable and universal right of all human beings.
What you saw in that video was President Reagan's words from 1982, 40 years ago this year, overlaid, of course, with images from today's world, not from the Soviet Union, but from Russia today, from the Chinese Communist Party, from their actions in Hong Kong, in Western China against the Uyghurs. We'll talk more about today's challenges in a bit, but I want to highlight what I see as the most important aspects of this speech. What are the key points that President Reagan makes in the Westminster address? It was when he talked in the most fulsome sense, as Roger said, he talked about freedom in every speech, almost in every line, every paragraph of every speech. But this was a speech where he really outlined his vision in really clear terms. First, he talked about the ideological component to our competition. And that's something that was true certainly in the context of the Cold War, but is true today as well. We know that especially in our competition against Vladimir Putin's Russia, against the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, the way that we're in strategic competition with those countries is true, but there's also a way in which our values are different. President Reagan talked about his vision for the end of the Cold War. He said, "We win, they lose," which was certainly a stark way to put it, but he also talked about his long-term vision, not just the short-term, the march toward freedom and democracy. This is the speech where he talks about putting communism on the ash heap of history. And that's an aspect of America's global pursuit of freedom that remains unfinished, that in that way, the struggle between freedom and opponents of freedom exists still today. Number two, freedom is a universal right. This is an aspect of the speech where President Reagan really talks about the way that our values are not properly ours. They're not American or what was sometimes called Western values. They're universal values. They're the birthright of all human beings. They're universal in nature, and they're inalienable. They're yours just because you were born, no matter what country on earth you were born in. And in fact, that those of us that were born into freedom bear a special obligation to help those around the world access their own freedom. And that leads into the third pillar of the speech, that we must take action to promote democracy. That this isn't work that happens as history progresses. It's not an end state that we can achieve in the near term. And it's not just, that democracy is not a fragile flower. President Reagan talks about it in very poetic terms in this speech. But that the flower of democracy does need cultivating. And that if we want for freedom and democracy to grow around the world, we must take action to ensure that. What exactly should we do? President Reagan calls in this speech for a global campaign for democracy. And that's just what happens. I love this part of the story about the Westminster Address because as a former speechwriter, this is one great example in American history where a speech really changes policy and impacts policy. Back in Washington, there was an ongoing debate about how important this work to promote freedom and democracy in the world, how important was that work? Of course, there were other strains of American politics that said, yeah, let's constrain democracy, let's try to, communism, but maybe that it wasn't our role to go about promoting freedom and democracy around the world. And largely because of this speech, a presidential speech, as it turns out, can be a great motivator. Back in Washington, the US government put into place what they called the Democracy Program to see, well, what should we do about this? What should a global campaign for democracy look like? And they commissioned a study, and ultimately the program recommended the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy. This is a non-governmental, private, nonprofit organization, but that's funded by the government and subject to congressional oversight. And the work of the National Endowment for Democracy was to execute that campaign for global democracy that President Reagan called for. The purpose would be to foster the infrastructure of democracy. President Reagan saw that everything from the free press to labor unions to political parties to universities to free enterprise, the private sector. And it was established in 1983, just 1 year after President Reagan's Westminster Address, when Congress passed it into law and President Reagan signed the annual State Department bill. So another thing that was different 40 years ago is that you could get things done and big things done in Washington very quickly. And it had these 4 core institutions: the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, which are the political branches affiliated with the Democratic and Republican parties domestically, but not organizationally connected to those parties. These NDI and IRI work around the world with center-left and center-right political parties doing training, doing election observation, providing assistance to really foster the infrastructure of electoral democracy. And then the key institutions on the economic side, again, sort of a nod to both the right and the left. The Center for International Private Enterprise, affiliated with the US Chamber of Commerce, and the Solidarity Center, affiliated with the AFL-CIO. President Reagan saw these as labor unions and private enterprise as central to democratic governance in a different way as well, and maintaining the political rights of citizens around the world. And for the most part, this architecture from 1983, building on that 1982 speech, remains in place today. The organizations have evolved over the years, but this is really still the institutional architecture that the US relies on for our work to promote freedom and democracy around the world. Well, what's happened since then? This chart shows how many free, partly free, and unfree countries there are around the world since the late 1970s. The data is from an organization called Freedom House. Janet shared some Freedom House data in her presentation as well. They collect, on every country in the world, statistics each year on the health of their democratic institutions and cultures of freedom in their own countries. Things like, of course, free and fair elections, but also the rule of law, protection of individual rights and religious freedom. Oh, having the same problem.
I was trying to.
Yeah, they didn't like it. And what you see, of course, over time, you see some trends. You see a spike through the 1980s after the 1982 Westminster speech from President Reagan, which is that first red line on the left. You see quite a marked spike, of course, after the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall, the red line on the right, as countries of the former Soviet Union that were behind the Iron Curtain became free. And then you see sort of a steady incline through the 90s and the 2000s, looking not just at that, the blue line tracking partly free nations, but also the gold tracking free nations. And in the last few years, it's kind of leveled off since about 2010. And in the most recent years, just the last 2 or 3 years, we're seeing those trend lines start to decline. And that's part of what Freedom House, this report they put out every year, has tracked most recently an overall decline in the number of free countries around the world and freedom around the world within those countries for 15 consecutive years. Part of it is what some call a democratic backsliding, that countries that had made progress toward democracy through the 90s and early 2000s were starting to sort of go in the opposite direction. Russia's probably the best example of that, of course. Through the 90s, in the Yeltsin years, with Boris Yeltsin in charge, there was a lot of move toward freedom. There was talk of joining global organizations and becoming a responsible global actor. And then in the Putin era, obviously, that started to go in a different direction. But that's happened in other countries as well, where new and fragile democracies see challenges and start to take some steps backward. But it's also been happening in mature democracies, and that's the data that Janet shared from the United States, even where with challenges to our own democracy and democratic institutions at home, our own rating in this way, although we are still categorized as a free nation, and proudly so, has started to move in the wrong direction. Why is this happening? Well, it's not just that freedom is in retreat, but the forces of authoritarianism, or totalitarianism, as President Reagan called it in the video, are on the rise. And the most prominent examples of that, of course, are Russia and China. Those are the countries that our national security strategy identify as our primary strategic competitors in the military and economic realms, especially with regard to China on the economy and Russia on the economic front with NATO. But there are also countries that have ambitions beyond their borders, that they actually seek to reshape the world in accordance with their authoritarian model. So it's no accident. Talking about Russia a bit, the Kremlin for years has had a policy of assassinating opposition political leaders to silence any dissent. You see images there on the top left of Boris Nemtsov, who during the 90s was viewed as the successor to Boris Yeltsin. He was a provincial governor at the time. He tried to run against President Putin over the years, back when they actually allowed opposition candidates on the ballot. And just under 10 years ago, 2014, I think, he was shot 4 times in the back, crossing a bridge just steps from the Kremlin. His associate on the bottom there, Vladimir Kara-Murza, has been poisoned not once but twice, and for years walked with a cane, although he's healthy and well now. And Alexei Navalny on the right, in headlines just in the last few years for his own poisoning, returned to Russia, put in prison, still imprisoned, recently recategorized as a terrorist, to allow even harsher prison conditions. Russia's malign activities, though, are not confined to their borders. Of course, we heard a lot about their election interference in our own country. That's something that they do around the world, certainly in Europe. In the small country of Montenegro, they architected a coup that involved killing the prime minister, which was foiled only hours before they started to act. And then, broader efforts to spread disinformation, which has an effect on our elections, but also is just about kind of sowing dissent and division in democratic and free societies. And then, of course, in recent days, more literal attacks on free and democratic nations. You see there some imagery of the Russian troop positions at the Ukrainian border. Lots of questions about what they'll do there, but of course, remember that they've invaded Ukraine in the past. In 2014, they invaded Georgia in 2008. And so they've clearly got ambitions beyond their borders in attacking free and democratic nations as well. The human rights abuses of the Chinese Communist Party are kind of increasingly well known. In Western China, the Chinese central government is systematically rounding up the Uyghur ethnic minority and religious minority. It's a regional Muslim group where they're held in detention and re-education camps. Families are separated. There's a lot of forced labor that happens, and certainly allegations of torture and abuse as well. And there's one aspect of Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs that doesn't get as much attention, say, as the forced labor and detention, but is really important to this calling it a genocide. The Chinese are implementing forced sterilization of Uyghur women. And that's something that really shows you it's not just about controlling the population, it's about systematic elimination of the population. And that's why just last year, the United States State Department labeled this a genocide. In Hong Kong, they're cracking down on democracy. Of course, Hong Kong has been since 1997 under Chinese rule with promises that their free and democratic society would be allowed to continue uninterrupted. But in light of massive protests in the streets of Hong Kong, the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing implemented a new national security law that has allowed their security police in Hong Kong to round up protesters, detain them indefinitely. You saw some footage of this in the video earlier. The violent crackdowns in Hong Kong, as well as the genocide against the Uyghurs in Western China, are all really empowered by the Chinese Communist Party's use of new technologies. So they're using things like facial recognition and artificial intelligence in addition, to surveil everyday citizens, to track them, to track their everyday activities. It allows them to target those who are, especially in the case of Hong Kong, activists for freedom and democracy. But it also allows them, even in mainland China, to track the daily activities of everyday citizens, and then they assign these social credit scores to people that allow the Chinese Communist Party to really restrict the capacity, the capability of everyday citizens to live their lives according to, these social credit scores and what the Chinese Communist Party determines as unworthy or worthy of punishment. The way that these new technologies have come into play recently, especially with regard to Russia, with regard to their disinformation activities, and China with this internal repression, it really shows that they're leveraging these 21st century tools. This isn't Chairman Mao's Chinese Communist Party in a rural and undeveloped China. This is really a 21st century state that's leveraging all of those tools to restrict freedom, to crack down on democracy. Well, what does this have to do with us? We hear about authoritarianism and human rights abuses in other countries. We hear about how they're finding these new ways to use this technology to oppress their own citizens. They're exporting those tools to other countries, smaller countries, to repress their own citizens. But ultimately, the goal of the work of the authoritarians in these countries isn't just to control within their borders, or even to spread their model of authoritarianism. It's to undermine the universal values that we claim. China's crackdown in Hong Kong, or Russia's attempted coup in Montenegro, it's not just about controlling people who live there. The ultimate goal is undermining democracy itself. And so I think the goals, their ultimate goals when it comes to spreading disinformation, even in our own country, isn't just to get us to believe that fake news, but to get us to question our own institutions, to undermine our faith in our system and our values. And that especially matters here in the US, where our whole system is built on faith in the system, is built on our civic health that Janet talked about, and is built on those values. One piece of good news is that the American people know this and they care. 75% of Americans are concerned about rising authoritarianism. It's hard to get 3/4 of the American people to agree on about anything these days, but that statistic is from our latest Reagan National Defense Survey, which is an annual public opinion poll that we put out on a variety of foreign policy and national security issues each year. It's available on the table outside if you want to grab one on your way out. When we ask American people particularly what concerns them about China, which they perceive as the greatest threat to our country, there's almost an even tie between concern over China's unfair kind of economic and trade practices, concern about their military buildup, number 2, and concern about their human rights abuses, number 3, all within 3 points of each other. And so I think Americans really understand kind of the multifaceted challenge that China's presenting, and human rights are very much front of mind along with their economic and military challenge. And Janet talked about what young people do and do not believe. One interesting takeaway from the survey this year was that for young people, for Americans under 30, human rights abuses are their single foremost concern with regard to China. 33% prioritize human rights abuses for Americans under 30. I think this means that the American people really see kind of these commitments to freedom and democracy that President Reagan talked about as core to our DNA as a country, who we are as a nation. And that's why I think that, it's not just this work when we think about the global campaign for democracy. It's not just about spreading our values or American values. As we talked about, it's about allowing people around the world to access these universal values. And also, it's linked to our interests as well, our security and economic interests. What is the Reagan Institute doing about this all? So these negative trends on freedom and democracy and human rights around the world, In 2020, we launched our newest policy center, the Center for Freedom and Democracy, which I helped to lead. Secretary Mike Pompeo joined us as the sitting Secretary of State. And the core policy project of this center is called the Westminster 2.0 Working Group. So thinking back to that Reagan address from the British Parliament in Westminster, what's the 2.0 approach to doing this work? He talked about doing the work to promote freedom and democracy around the world in the context of the Cold War, the 1980s, the 20th century. How do we think about doing that work in today's different world, in the 21st century, with those new technological tools that we talked about, but also with new countries on the other side of this struggle? What's changed in the last 40 years, and how should we modernize our approaches to meet those changing priorities and challenges? The working group has been meeting for the last 2 years, since 2020, and we'll put out a report with some policy recommendations this summer around the 40th anniversary of that speech, which is in June. But these are the 6 areas where the working group has decided it's important to focus. Again, what's different in today's world, or what's maybe of renewed importance in today's world, and what should we do about it? Those new technologies. Our opponents are very good at leveraging those new technologies to suppress and restrict freedom. But how should we, the United States and the rest of the free world, how can we leverage some of those new technologies to serve freedom, to advance freedom? Combating corruption. So many autocratic regimes survive by ripping off their own citizens. Alexei Navalny, currently in prison as a terrorist in Russia, basically all he did was report on the corrupt practices of Putin and his cronies. That was his crime. And so how can we help expose those crimes of autocratic leaders to their own citizens and show them that actually democracy and our process of transparency can help lead to better outcomes in those countries for their own sake? Supporting an independent media and journalism. That's one of the main ways that you report on things like corruption and cronyism within authoritarian systems. Free media is not just kind of a First Amendment right here in the United States, but it's also a core democratic institution without which democracy itself is in peril. And so supporting both that kind of investigative journalists and the way that a free media in other countries can thrive is an important part of this work. Fostering citizen-centered governance. We talked about those new democracies just starting out on their transition toward freedom. How can we help them consolidate those democratic gains? How can we help them deliver on the promises that they made to their people? You know, what we don't want is countries that transition toward freedom to say, boy, you know, that dictator we used to have was at least better at picking up the trash and fixing the potholes. We want democracy to really deliver for its citizens, and we should help other countries do that. Protecting persecuted groups, marginalized communities around the world, you know, not just the Uyghurs in China, of course, who are a religious and ethnic minority, but women, young people, the LGBTQ community. They're targeted just for being who they are, and targeted violently for being who they are. And that's, you know, I think the US has an obligation to stand up for those groups who are targeted simply for their identities. And finally, working with international partners. There's a reason President Reagan gave his speech in the United Kingdom. This isn't work that the United States can or should do alone. And actually working with partners around the world is a strategic advantage of ours. Russia and China don't have allies. They bully others to do what they want. But we have countries that share our interests, that share our values, and we should lean into working together with those countries to do this work. Why does the Reagan Institute do this? Well, of course, because it was important to President Reagan. Whoops. Which is supposed to be a lovely photo of the president there. Including a key quote of his that talks about how the survival of democracy doesn't just doesn't inherit from generation to generation, as we know, but that free men and women actually have to accept the responsibilities of our own freedom. That simply being free isn't enough, that there are responsibilities and obligations that come along with that, and that's why this important work, that we should do this important work in the world in terms of helping other countries access their own freedom, and it's certainly why we at the Reagan Institute do this work, and we hope that you'll join us in that as well. Happy to take questions, but really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Rachel. That was great, and a great example of how we take ideas and values that were relevant 40 years ago, but actually, as Rachel outlined, are critical today. You don't have to look beyond above the fold in any newspaper to know that freedom is under assault as you think about the Russian buildup around Ukraine. If anybody has questions, raise your hand. I'll get things started. We'll look at that. Lots of questions. Rachel, before we go to the group, just answer one for me. It kind of is the bridge between Janet's talk and your talk. Whether you look at the Republican Party and neo-isolationism, President Trump came into office talking about we have to focus at home, pull out of Afghanistan, pull out of Iraq. Barack Obama said we need to rebuild at home. I mean, it's a bipartisan view and strong voices on the margin of each party saying that we really shouldn't be advancing our values, and we have to de-emphasize leadership in the world. I know the National Defense Survey folks talked to us about the kind of the political climate in the United States and the support of advancing freedom and democracy within the United States.
Sure, it's a great question, just in terms of...
By the way, everybody who works at the Institute has to tell me I ask great questions. That's a prerequisite.
Question.
Yes, thank you.
The data that we have from the Reagan National Defense Survey shows that, while political leaders may sort of come down on one side or the other of how important American leadership in the world is, it is important to the American people. So a plurality of the American people in our survey say that they'd prefer that America be more engaged in the world, that it take the lead when it comes to international events. But plurality means not a majority. So there's a sizable minority of the American people who would prefer that we take more of a back seat and kind of, react to events in limited circumstances rather than have an active global leadership role. But a growing area of public opinion is people who say, I don't know, or it depends, when we ask them that question. And I think that's something where, especially as an organization dedicated to promoting President Reagan's ongoing legacy, he made the case to the American people about why it was important that America lead in the world, what those outcomes would be in terms of the Cold War, in terms of those suffering in unfree countries, in terms of advancing America's strategic, military, and economic interests. And that's what I'd like to see from leaders today, and we see that from leaders on both sides of the aisle. In fact, there are Republicans and Democrats who stand up and take on that mantle of President Reagan's leadership and say that American leadership in the world matters. And one thing we see on polling on foreign policy issues in particular is that the American people really respond to the ways that our national leaders talk about these issues.
Questions? Let's see, we had a hand over here. Sir.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a danger in overemphasizing freedom without defining it more clearly. If freedom means the absence of autocracy, fine. That sounds good. If freedom means you can do anything you want, the government says wear a mask, I don't want to wear a mask. I'm free. I'm going to influence other people. So there's a limit to personal freedom without endangering other people. So if you could define freedom more clearly when you talk about it, I think that would help.
Well, that's a great question, and I don't work for you, so you can trust me when I tell you that it's a good question. I can tell you how President Reagan thought about that, which was that he talked about personal freedom in the context of ordered liberty and the rule of law. And so I think that kind of gets at the balance of what you're talking about, where, of course, we want to emphasize personal freedom, the rights of the individual. That's core to any proper understanding of freedom. But that it's put in the context of of the community, of the society, of the country, of the world, and of our obligations there, to live in a way and to make choices in a way that creates an ordered society, ordered liberty. And I think that's another, we at the Reagan Institute are big fans of Reagan quotes and Reagan ideas, but I think that's one that is very relevant to the way that we think about this in today's world as well.
More questions over here. Lady in the front.
Hello. First of all, I think these terms, freedom and democracy, they're just generic platitudes at this point. All of the values that Reagan had, they don't exist anymore in 2022. Democracy, what does that mean? What right? It really upsets me that America takes the moral high ground and wants to tell other countries what to do. We're killing kids in our schools. We're killing black people. Black kids that drive cars have a 33% more chance of dying than anyone else. We have the NRA, the indiscrimination of wealth. Does democracy mean that we have more billionaires that could travel in their jets and not have to stand in line for 3 hours at the airports? And the other people that are really poor, they can't even afford to travel. This is just crazy. We have no right to talk about this as far as authoritarianism goes. We just all witnessed what happens. America was trying to become authoritarian. And, we just went through all of that. And so we all know the problems that are going on now, the divisiveness. So I just think we have to update some of the so-called American values before we try to generically force feed them, with platitudes to all these other countries. We have no right to tell anyone else what to do until we get our own house in order.
Your points are well taken. We do not have a perfect democracy at home by any means. We never have, and we face particular challenges in recent years, the ones that you point out, around injustice, around the health of our own democratic institutions. The one thing I'll disagree with what you said is that we have to get our own house in order before helping others, because I feel strongly that based on people I've talked to around the world, based on what I hear from people fighting for freedom in other countries, they still look at us as an example, not of a perfect democracy, but of a free country who's working on getting better, who's working on our democracy. And we've taken steps forward, we've taken steps backward, but it's in our founding document. We want to work toward being a more perfect union.
All right, we're going to go over here to Al, but Rachel, you want to take the last one? What does freedom mean to you? And then Al will go next.
I think it's more than a platitude. I think it means living in, I think freedom to me means living in a society where individuals can make their own choices better than the government in the context of ordered liberty. And so it's that balance. But I haven't satisfied you. Well, I'm sitting next to you at lunch, so we'll debate it out over dessert.
All right, Al, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, not too loud. All right, you have a right to say this is not a great question. So let's start with
Thank
that.
you.
All right. First, a comment quickly and a challenge to you quickly. The observation, I spent the greater part of the 90s working with the National Endowment for the Democracy and the groups that funded. After Reagan left office, his successor came in as the wall came down, and we were all challenged. The group I was with, the Citizens Democracy Corps, but I could name 20 others I was involved with. We must have sent thousands, if not tens of thousands, and even more volunteers. Ground up democracy, as you said. We send engineers and waste management companies to Hungary to fill potholes and deal with pollution. We sent educators to Moscow to reform universities. Our board was chaired by Drew Lewis, Ronald Reagan's transportation secretary, and I can go right down the list of, all the number one names of the 80s of both parties. I had a wonderful banquet, just like this one, hosted by Boris Nemtsov.
Yeah.
He was mayor of Nizhny Novgorod. Maggie Thatcher called Jim Baker and said, "You got to see this guy. He's on fire." Okay, this is one assassinated by Mr. Putin. Okay, last part of the comment. The unstated end goal was these nations, or newer democracies, or former democracies that lost democracy and wanted to rejoin the West. The end of the game, the EU and NATO. This was a new millennial, the literal sense and the figurative sense. Now we have a situation where Hungary is certainly in both. In the EU, they're having a problem with the other nations because they won't abide by the UN Charter of Human Rights, which means free press and opposition party and free speech, and they're kicking out universities and a lot of Westerners. And on the question of Ukraine, a number of people in the military are debating with themselves and with their British partners how much information can they share with the people we couldn't wait to admit to NATO. And I would add Poland and some others. Although on Russia, Poland is still pretty good, but okay. So my challenge to you is, as we move forward, and this is by the way, this is a wonderful little journal. I just thumbed through it, but I assigned it to, I was a former professor. You should all read some of this. I would commission another one and go back to this era. What did we get right? And more importantly, what did we get wrong? How can this happen? I mean, how can a group, CPAC, which is a conservative youth group when I was coming up, now have their International Conference of Conservative Groups no place other than Hungary? They're not going to London, they're not going to Paris, they're not even coming here anymore. We all know about the Tucker Carlson broadcast from Hungary. So my question is not to beat up on him or anybody else. My question is, this is 30 years now since Ronald Reagan delivered that magnificent speech. Or is it 40 years? My math is not very good. 30 years. 40. 30 years. Okay, that was 40. My God, that was the same speech with the ash heap of history. It was somewhere else. Yeah, okay. 40 years since Ronald Reagan issued the challenge. I would look at what we have done in this area the last 30 years and issue at the end of that report, maybe it's the second report probably, a challenge to Biden and to the United States Congress to get moving here. And as we approach the 24 election, most of the candidates should be able to be asked in a debate or elsewhere how they're going to pick this up and get back to where we were and where did we make a wrong turn? Or did we make a wrong turn? So I just throw that back as a challenge to you.
Yeah, your framing I think is really helpful, and it's very much the way that this Westminster 2.0 working group that's coming out with the report this summer is that we're thinking about that at the Reagan Institute. We're working. One of our co-chairs is Ken Wallach. So we're working with Ken and Derek Mitchell and Dan Twining and Mark Green and others who have really been at the center of doing this work for the last 40 years to learn exactly those questions. What's worked, what hasn't, where have we gone wrong, where can we redirect? And so stay tuned for hopefully some good ideas that the new administration, or the not so new administration, but the Biden administration, the Congress can take up, and that would actually be actionable to advance those goals.
So we have time for a few more questions. We'll go to the gentleman over here to my right, and then we'll go back to the front.
Thank you for your presentation. I love Ronald Reagan. I grew up in high school and in lower school with him, and I just felt so safe. I felt so cared for by our president. My thinking about freedom is, I believe the main element of freedom is the ability to choose. What's that choice? Well, in my belief, I'm a Christian. I believe it's the freedom to choose my faith. And what I think the ultimate truth is, and for me, that's Jesus Christ. I think one of the biggest strengths of this country is our Judeo-Christian aspect, among other things. So my question is this: did you consider, because I'm going to put my question in the form of a question, did you consider the faith? I'm not actually that familiar with Reagan's faith. I believe he's Christian. He was Christian. He and Nancy were Christian. But would he downplay that for kind of a more universal appeal to people of all faiths? Did you consider that in your, when you got the 6 points or whatever your philosophy is? How do you approach that aspect that freedom is for many other things, probably the greatest thing is for faith?
Right. President Reagan was a Christian. He talked quite a bit and worked quite a bit during his presidency on protecting freedom of religion, freedom of conscience around the world, particularly as it at the time in the context of Cold War, the Soviet Jewry, so the Jewish population in the Soviet Union. Natan Sharansky, one of the great dissidents of the Cold War who spent time in the Soviet Gulag, a major champion of both Sharansky and Reagan, champions of the freedom to believe, to worship, to not believe, to not worship as you choose. And I think that method of autocratic control or totalitarian control in cracking down on that, I think is one of the aspects of freedom that really motivated President Reagan to stand up for that work, not in a sectarian or denominational way only for Christians, but for people of any religion or no religion all around the world.
Just add to that as we go to the question in the front. President Reagan worked very closely with the Pope
Yes.
for the freedom and the plight of those in Poland and the behind the curtain.
Mine is not exactly a question. I just think that Rochelle's comments should be somewhat answered, because I don't think things was bad in this nation as she makes it out to be. And if you look at the number of people having medical care now who did 40 years ago or 50 years ago, it's way up. The standard of living in this nation is way up. Racism is down enormously. If you look at a graph of racism in this nation and how it's declined over the years, and how probably today we may be the least racist country just about anywhere. The police have been maligned. A lot of this comes from the media and what's been done. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of improvement to be done. The major improvement to be done is to be able to function efficiently and have the two parties work together instead of at each other's throats. But the nation is still a darn good place, and I just thought your comments were extreme, and I just wanted to give a counterpoint of view.
Well, we're getting at what the Reagan Institute likes, which is positive friction, disagreeing without being disagreeable. And I think all of these conversations are really important, not just to, what we have here at home, how we can and should do this work abroad, and to President Reagan's legacy as well.
All right, time for a couple more.
Well, mine will be short because it's actually a question. One theme in both presentations was the debilitating effects of disinformation. You are discussing it in an international context from hostile foreign governments, and whether it's from hostile foreign governments or domestic actors that was discussed in the context of declining civics. So I would open up to you or anyone else who'd like to comment from the Reagan Institution. What are the steps on both a governmental level, domestically or internationally, and an individual level we should take to combat disinformation?
You go, Rachel. Rachel, you taking that on disinformation?
I was looking at Janet because I think in the domestic context she can probably speak to it a little bit more than I can. But through our Westminster 2.0 project, we've been looking at some case studies from countries that are doing this effectively. Two examples, they're small countries, but on the borders of the hostile foreign powers you mentioned, Taiwan and Estonia. And they're really working hard to build, they call it the civic tech community. So people that are, technology warriors who want to work for the civic good. They don't work for the government. They're sort of hackers for, what do they call it? Hackers for good. And they're working to empower the citizens in those countries with the tools that they need to be able to tell good information from bad information. And that doesn't mean things I disagree with as opposed to things I agree with. It means, it's true disinformation targeted at those populations. So that's one thing we're looking at from the foreign policy perspective.
So from a domestic perspective, it turns out this is a practice when we discern information. So at Stanford, they have a project on misinformation. And if you're
we're going to leave it there. Join me in thanking Rachel for her presentation.
Thank you.
I encourage everybody to stick around. We'll be here if you want to follow up with Rachel or Janet or anybody from the Reagan Institute to talk more about our programs or the issues we discussed. But before I return the mic to our hosts, Dale, if it's okay, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Michelle Keegan. She's the Chief Development Officer of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, and she's really responsible for connecting with Dale and the Coudert. And over to you.
Thank you, Roger, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. For those of you as on your way out, we at the Reagan Foundation always believe in bringing gifts. So we have our 2022 calendar. Also, if you're more interested in learning about the work of the foundation, I've actually left my business cards out there, and we'd be happy to sign you up for information about the Institute or the other programs that we're doing at the foundation and library in California. And I'll be down because I would really love to thank 4 wonderful women who actually made today possible. First of all, I want to thank Debbie and Susan with the Coudert Institute. We got a couple of gifts for you ladies. Thank you both so much for all you did to help out. And then I would also like to thank Mary Holohan. Mary over here actually introduced us to Dale and helped bring all of this together. So I want to thank Mary for helping us. It's a little parting gift for you. And then, of course, for our wonderful host, Dale Coudert. So thank you all. Thank you for joining us, and please, if you have any questions for Roger or our team, Bob Cochran, who's part of my team here, is also happy to talk with you, and Lindsay Reynolds, who is also working with us at the foundation. So thank you all.